The silence in the mahogany boardroom was deafening as CEO Marcus Whitfield pointed toward the door, his voice dripping with condescension. "Pack your things, Denise. Your services are no longer required." What he didn't know was that Denise Washington had been quietly documenting every backdoor deal, every regulatory shortcut, and every financial manipulation that kept Whitfield Industries afloat. 23 years of insider knowledge was about to walk out that door, and the man who built his empire on cutting corners had just fired the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The elevator music played its cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the corporate execution about to unfold on the 37th floor of the Whitfield Industries tower. Denise Washington adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the stack of documents in her hands, the same way she had every Tuesday morning for the past 23 years. Board meeting minutes, quarterly projections, and 3 sealed envelopes that would never see the light of day if Marcus Whitfield had his way. The mahogany doors of Conference Room A gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, their reflection distorted like everything else in this building. Inside, Marcus Whitfield paced behind his leather chair like a caged animal in an expensive suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tie knotted with military precision, and his smile carried the warmth of a tax audit. At 48, he had inherited his father's company and his father's belief that success was measured by how many people you could crush on your way to the top. Denise knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. She had earned that right somewhere between preventing the Meadowbrook scandal from going public and covering up the environmental violations in Tennessee. Her navy blue dress was understated, professional, and completely invisible to the men who made decisions in rooms like this. That invisibility had been her greatest asset, and, as of today, their greatest mistake. Marcus glanced up from his phone, irritation flickering across his face like lightning before a storm. "Denise? Good. I need those Hartford projections updated before the morning call. And make sure legal gets the revised compliance reports. I don't want any surprises." She placed the documents on the polished table with the same precision she brought to everything else. "The Hartford projections are complete, but the compliance reports need your signature on the 3rd addendum, the one about the offshore restructuring." Marcus waved his hand dismissively, already turning his attention back to his phone. "Whatever. Just handle it. That's what you're here for." Denise had heard those words countless times before, but today they carried a different weight. She had seen the memo on his desk that morning, the one marked confidential, that outlined his plans to modernize the executive support structure. Translation: fire the old guard and hire younger, cheaper, more compliant replacements who wouldn't ask questions about missing environmental impact studies or backdated board resolutions. The boardroom filled with the usual suspects over the next 20 minutes. James Rothstein from legal, a man who had mastered the art of making illegal things sound merely creative. Sandra Chen from accounting, whose spreadsheets could make a federal deficit look like a rounding error. And David Mueller from operations, who had perfected the smile of someone who knew exactly which regulations to ignore and when to ignore them. Marcus stood at the head of the table, commanding attention like a general addressing his troops. Today marks a new chapter for Whitfield Industries. We're streamlining operations, cutting inefficiencies, and positioning ourselves for unprecedented growth. Some changes will be difficult, but necessary. Denise remained standing near the corner, notepad ready, pen poised to capture every word. She had transcribed thousands of meetings, documented countless decisions, and filed away secrets that could topple governments. But she also noticed things others missed. The way Marcus's left eye twitched when he talked about streamlining. The nervous energy that radiated from James whenever offshore accounts were mentioned. the subtle exchange of glances between Sandra and David whenever certain numbers were discussed. The conversation shifted to quarterly earnings, and Marcus launched into his favorite topic, maximizing profit through strategic resource allocation. He spoke in corporate buzzwords that translated to laying off workers, cutting benefits, and finding creative ways to avoid paying taxes. Denise transcribed every euphemism, every careful phrase designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Then came the moment she had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Marcus cleared his throat and straightened his tie, two tells that preceded every major announcement. As part of our modernization initiative, we'll be restructuring several key positions. Some rules that served us well in the past no longer align with our future vision. The room grew quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 37 floors below. Denise continued writing, her pen moving steadily across the page, even as her pulse quickened. Effective immediately, we'll be transitioning to a more dynamic executive support model. Denise, your position is being eliminated. We appreciate your years of service, but it's time for fresh perspectives and new approaches. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sandra stared at her laptop screen with sudden intensity. David found something fascinating about his coffee cup. None of them made eye contact with Denise, and none of them spoke in her defense.
Denise closed her notepad with a soft snap and looked directly at Marcus. Her expression remained neutral, professional, giving away nothing of the thoughts racing through her mind. After 23 years of loyal service, she had earned the right to dignity, even in dismissal. "I understand," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'll need to complete the quarterly filing transfers and secure the confidential archives before my departure. Standard protocol requires a 2-week transition period." Marcus shook his head impatiently. "That won't be necessary. Security will handle any sensitive materials. Please clean out your desk and surrender your access cards by the end of business today." The dismissal was swift, brutal, and completely characteristic of a man who had never understood the difference between efficiency and cruelty. But Marcus had made a critical error in his haste to remove what he saw as dead weight. He had never bothered to learn exactly what Denise did beyond scheduling meetings and taking notes. He had never asked about the filing system she had created, the relationships she had cultivated, or the information she had gathered during 2 decades of being invisible in rooms where secrets were traded like commodities. Denise gathered her notepad and stood with the same composure she had maintained through every crisis, every scandal, and every moral compromise she had witnessed from her corner of the boardroom. She nodded politely to the assembled executives, none of whom met her gaze, and walked toward the door with measured steps. As her hand touched the polished brass handle, she paused and turned back toward the table. "One final piece of business. The Cayman accounts that were transferred last quarter. The documentation is in my secure files. You'll want to review those carefully before the next audit cycle." Marcus looked up sharply, a flicker of concern crossing his features before his arrogance reasserted itself. "We'll manage just fine without your files, Denise. Everything important is backed up in multiple systems." "Of course," she replied with the hint of a smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the boardroom in uncomfortable silence. Marcus returned to his presentation about efficiency and modernization, but his voice carried a slight edge that hadn't been there before. The other executives nodded and murmured their agreement, but their attention seemed divided, as if they were trying to remember exactly what Denise had access to and what she might have overheard during all those years of faithful service. Denise walked through the executive corridor with the same steady pace she had maintained for over 2 decades. past the portraits of company founders, past the awards for corporate excellence, past the plaques celebrating environmental stewardship that were displayed just feet away from offices where environmental violations were planned and covered up. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She reached her desk, a modest workspace tucked into an alcove outside the executive suites. 23 years of professional life were contained in 4 drawers and 3 filing cabinets. 2 decades of calendars, correspondence, meeting notes, and the kind of institutional knowledge that couldn't be downloaded from a cloud server or transferred to a replacement. But hidden among the routine paperwork were copies of documents that told a very different story about Whitfield Industries than the one presented to shareholders and regulators. As she began emptying her desk drawers, Denise reflected on the irony of her situation. Marcus believed he was cutting costs and eliminating inefficiency. In reality, he had just fired the one person who had spent years protecting him from his own reckless decisions. She had covered up safety violations that could have resulted in criminal charges. She had managed offshore transfers that skirted the edges of federal law. She had maintained relationships with regulators, auditors, and government officials who trusted her word because she had never lied to them about anything they could verify. The small items went into a cardboard box: a coffee mug from her daughter's college, a desk calendar with her granddaughter's soccer schedule, a stress ball that had gotten her through more crisis management sessions than she could count. But the important items, the ones that really mattered, were already safely stored in locations that Marcus would never think to check. Her personal laptop, innocuous and overlooked, contained encrypted copies of every significant document that had crossed her desk. Email archives stretching back 15 years, including correspondence that executives thought had been permanently deleted. Audio recordings from meetings where she had been told to stop taking notes but had never been told to stop listening. Financial records that showed the true cost of the company's environmental cleanup efforts, not the sanitized version presented to EPA regulators. 23 years of being underestimated had taught Denise the value of thorough documentation. Every backdoor deal, every regulatory workaround, every instance of creative accounting had been carefully cataloged and preserved, not out of malice or a desire for revenge, but because she understood that in a company built on cutting corners, someone needed to keep track of which corners had been cut and when. As she packed the last items from her desk, Denise thought about the conversation she would have with her attorney tomorrow morning, about the phone call she would make to her contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, about the meeting she would request with the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. Marcus had spent years building his empire on a foundation of shortcuts and cover-ups, and he had just fired the architect who knew exactly where all the structural weaknesses were hidden. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The elevator doors opened with their familiar chime, and Denise stepped inside with her box of personal belongings. As the car descended past 37 floors of corporate ambition and ethical compromise, she allowed herself a small smile. Marcus Whitfield had always prided himself on making tough decisions quickly and decisively. Today, he made the fastest and most decisive mistake of his career. The lobby of Whitfield Industries buzzed with its usual afternoon energy. Executives rushing to meetings, assistants managing impossible schedules, security guards who nodded respectfully as she passed. None of them knew that they had just witnessed the beginning of the end for the company that had employed them. None of them understood that the quiet woman with the cardboard box had just walked out with the power to bring down everything Marcus had built. As Denise pushed through the revolving doors and stepped onto the sidewalk, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she had never hoped to use: Dr. Eleanor Martinez, the investigative journalist who had been trying to get an interview with someone from Whitfield Industries for the past 3 years, someone with inside knowledge of the company's operations. Someone willing to talk about what really happened behind the mahogany doors and marble facades. The afternoon sun felt warm on her face as she composed a simple text message. Available for that conversation we discussed. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come prepared to take notes. She hit send and walked toward her car. 23 years of silence finally coming to an end. Dr. Eleanor Martinez had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. As an investigative journalist specializing in corporate malfeasance, she had built her reputation on exposing the kind of financial crimes that most people never heard about until the handcuffs came out. Her Pulitzer nomination had come from a series on pharmaceutical companies hiding safety data, and her book on banking fraud had become required reading in forensic accounting programs across the country. The coffee shop on 5th Street was deliberately chosen for its anonymity. No corporate executives frequented the cramped space with mismatched furniture and a cash-only policy. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes early, claiming a corner table where she could observe the entrance while remaining inconspicuous. Her recording equipment was concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary leather portfolio, and her backup recorder was disguised as a smartphone charger. When Denise Washington walked through the door at exactly 2 o'clock, Eleanor recognized her immediately from the corporate headshots on Whitfield Industries' website. But the woman approaching her table carried herself differently than the polished professional in those carefully staged photos. There was a weight to her movements, a sense of purpose that suggested she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Denise slid into the chair across from Eleanor without ceremony. Her dark gray suit was conservative and expensive, the kind of outfit that telegraphed competence without drawing attention. She placed a slim leather briefcase on the table between them and folded her hands with the patience of someone who had spent decades waiting for the right moment to speak. Dr. Martinez, I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice. I believe you've been investigating Whitfield Industries for some time. Eleanor nodded, studying the woman across from her. In her experience, corporate whistleblowers fell into predictable categories: the idealistic employee shocked by corruption, the bitter executive seeking revenge, or the calculating insider looking for immunity deals. Denise Washington didn't fit any of those profiles. Her demeanor suggested someone who had made a careful decision based on years of deliberation rather than a moment of crisis. I've been trying to get someone from inside Whitfield to talk for 3 years. Most employees won't even acknowledge they work there, let alone discuss internal operations. What changed your mind? Denise opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. 23 years of watching criminals pretend to be businessmen. Today, they decided my services were no longer required. Today, I decided their secrets were no longer my responsibility. The folder contained photocopies of documents that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Financial statements that showed massive discrepancies between reported and actual expenses. Environmental impact assessments that had been altered after regulatory submission. Correspondence between executives discussing the deliberate concealment of safety violations. Each page represented a potential federal crime, and there were hundreds of pages. Eleanor examined the first few documents with the trained eye of someone who had spent years learning to distinguish between legitimate corporate practices and criminal behavior. The sophistication of the schemes was impressive, involving multiple subsidiaries, offshore accounts, and regulatory arbitrage that bordered on genius. But the documentation was even more impressive, showing a level of detail that could only come from someone with unprecedented access to confidential information. How long have you been collecting this material? Since my 3rd year with the company. I started keeping copies of everything after I was asked to lie to EPA investigators about a chemical spill in Georgia. My supervisor called it protecting proprietary information. I called it obstruction of justice. The Georgia incident had been Denise's awakening to the true nature of her employer. A storage tank containing industrial solvents had ruptured during a routine maintenance procedure, releasing thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals into groundwater that supplied drinking water to 3 rural communities. The EPA investigation had been thorough and aggressive, But their findings had been based on falsified testing data and deliberately incomplete incident reports. Denise was the one tasked with coordinating the company's response to regulatory inquiries. She had watched executives coach witnesses, destroy evidence, and present fabricated documentation with the confidence of people who believed their wealth and influence made them untouchable. The investigation had eventually been closed with minimal fines and no criminal charges, but the contaminated groundwater continued to poison families who had no idea their wells had been compromised. That's when I realized that my job wasn't just administrative support. I was part of a criminal conspiracy, whether I wanted to or not. Every document I filed, every meeting I scheduled, every phone call I screened was helping them cover up crimes that were literally killing people. Eleanor flipped through more pages, recognizing patterns that indicated systematic fraud rather than isolated incidents. The Cayman Islands accounts that were used to hide environmental cleanup costs from insurance companies, the subsidiary corporations created specifically to declare bankruptcy and avoid liability for workplace injuries, the elaborate scheme involving carbon credit trading that generated millions in revenue from pollution that had never actually been reduced. What's the scope of what you have here?
Everything. Financial records going back 15 years. Audio recordings of executive meetings where they discussed which regulations to ignore and which regulators to bribe. Video surveillance from board meetings where they planned cover-ups. Email correspondence between executives and their contacts at regulatory agencies. The audio recordings were perhaps the most damaging evidence Denise possessed. Her responsibilities had included setting up recording equipment for board meetings, supposedly for the purpose of creating accurate minutes. But she had also maintained personal backups of those recordings. And the executives had grown careless about what they said when they believed their conversations were being captured only for internal documentation. One recording from the previous summer contained Marcus Whitfield explicitly instructing his legal team to delay environmental cleanup efforts until after quarterly earnings were reported, even though the delay would extend the exposure of local residents to known carcinogens. Another featured Sandra Chen explaining how accounting irregularities could be hidden through strategic subsidiary transfers that would take auditors years to unravel. But the most damaging recording was from a private meeting between Marcus and representatives from a lobbying firm specializing in regulatory capture. The conversation included detailed discussions of which EPA officials could be influenced through campaign contributions, which senators would support legislation favorable to the chemical industry, and how much money would be required to ensure that pending environmental regulations would be weakened or delayed. Eleanor understood the magnitude of what she was seeing. This wasn't just corporate fraud or environmental violations. This was evidence of a systematic effort to corrupt the regulatory process itself, involving bribery, conspiracy, and the deliberate endangerment of public health. The implications extended far beyond Whitfield Industries to include government officials, regulatory agencies, and potentially dozens of other corporations using similar tactics. Why now? You could have released this information years ago. Denise leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the deliberateness that characterized all her responses. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is, I was afraid, not just of legal consequences, but of what would happen to all the innocent people who work for the company. Thousands of employees who have no idea what their executives are doing, who depend on their jobs to support their families. The moral complexity of her situation had paralyzed Denise for years. She understood that exposing Whitfield's crimes would likely result in criminal prosecutions, massive fines, and potentially the collapse of the entire company. Thousands of workers would lose their jobs, pension funds would be decimated, and communities that depended on Whitfield facilities would face economic devastation. But she also knew that allowing the crimes to continue meant that more people would be poisoned, more communities would be contaminated, and more families would suffer from preventable illnesses. Yesterday, Marcus made the decision for me. He fired me not because I was incompetent, but because he wanted to replace institutional knowledge with ignorant compliance. He wants people who will follow orders without understanding what those orders really mean. He wants to eliminate anyone who might question whether what we're doing is legal or ethical. Eleanor recognized the psychology of corporate whistleblowing. Most people who exposed major fraud weren't motivated primarily by justice or moral outrage. They were motivated by the realization that they had been betrayed by institutions they had served faithfully. Denise Washington had spent over 2 decades protecting Marcus Whitfield from the consequences of his criminal behavior, and his response had been to discard her as obsolete equipment. What's your plan? Are you looking for immunity, witness protection, financial compensation? Denise shook her head. I don't want immunity because I don't plan to commit any crimes. I don't need witness protection because I'm not afraid of Marcus Whitfield or his lawyers, and I don't want financial compensation because this isn't about money. Eleanor had interviewed dozens of corporate whistleblowers, and she had never encountered someone with Denise's combination of preparation, evidence, and apparent lack of self-interest. Most people who exposed corporate crimes weren't seeking revenge against employers who had wronged them or attempting to negotiate favorable treatment from prosecutors. Denise seemed motivated by something more complex and potentially more dangerous, a sense of professional responsibility that transcended personal considerations. I want accountability. I want the families in Georgia to know why their children are getting sick. I want the workers in Tennessee to understand why their cancer rates are 3 times the national average. I want the shareholders who invested in Whitfield to know that their money has been funding criminal enterprises. And I want Marcus Whitfield to face the same legal system that he's been bribing and manipulating for decades. The evidence Denise possessed was sufficient to trigger multiple federal investigations. The EPA violations alone could result in hundreds of millions in fines and potential criminal charges for executive officers. The securities fraud could lead to SEC enforcement actions that would effectively end the careers of everyone in senior management. The bribery and conspiracy charges could result in lengthy prison sentences for dozens of people. But Eleanor understood that possession of evidence was only the beginning of the process. Successful prosecution of corporate crimes required careful coordination between multiple agencies, protected witnesses, and the kind of media attention that would prevent the case from being buried through political influence or procedural delays. How do you want to proceed? We could start with a single story focusing on one specific incident, build public interest, and then gradually release more information. Or we could go with everything at once, create maximum impact, but risk the story being too complex for public understanding. Denise had already considered these options during the sleepless night that followed her termination. She understood that the timing and method of disclosure would determine not just the effectiveness of the exposure, but the safety of everyone involved. Marcus Whitfield had spent years developing relationships with people who specialized in making problems disappear, and those people wouldn't hesitate to use intimidation or worse to protect their investments. Maximum impact. If we release information gradually, they'll have time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and prepare legal strategies. If we hit them with everything simultaneously, they'll be too busy managing the crisis to cover their tracks effectively. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the wisdom of overwhelming targets before they could mount effective defenses. But she also understood the risks involved in taking on adversaries with unlimited resources and no apparent ethical constraints. We'll need to coordinate with federal investigators before publication. The FBI, EPA, SEC, and possibly others will want to review the evidence and potentially launch their own investigations. That could delay publication for months. Denise reached into her briefcase and withdrew a second folder, thicker than the first. I've already contacted the appropriate authorities. Agent Rebecca Torres at the FBI's Corporate Crime Division has been expecting my call. Director James Patterson at the EPA's Criminal Investigation Office has been briefed on the scope of potential violations. Commissioner Sarah Davidson at the SEC has been provided with preliminary financial data indicating massive securities fraud. The level of preparation demonstrated by Denise's preemptive outreach to law enforcement was unprecedented in Eleanor's experience. Most whistleblowers approach journalists first, hoping to generate media attention that would force regulatory action. Denise had reversed the process, ensuring that investigators would be ready to act immediately when the story broke. How long have you been planning this?
Since the day they have asked me to lie to federal investigators, I realized that eventually someone was going to discover what Whitfield Industries was really doing. When that happened, I wanted to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Eleanor understood that she was witnessing something extraordinary. the systematic dismantling of a criminal enterprise by someone who had helped build it. Denise Washington possessed not just evidence of corporate crimes, but detailed knowledge of how those crimes had been concealed, which officials had been corrupted, and where additional evidence could be found. She wasn't just a whistleblower. She was an architect of accountability. The magnitude of the story was becoming clear to Eleanor. This wouldn't just be an exposé of one corrupt corporation. It would be a comprehensive examination of how regulatory capture functioned in practice, how environmental crimes were concealed from public scrutiny, and how wealthy executives used political influence to avoid consequences for criminal behavior. The implications would extend far beyond Whitfield Industries to include fundamental questions about corporate accountability and environmental justice. "When do you want to publish?" Denise checked her watch with the precision of someone whose life had been governed by schedules and deadlines for over 2 decades. "The federal raids on Whitfield facilities are scheduled to begin Monday morning at 6 a.m. I'd like the story to publish simultaneously so Marcus can read about his crimes in the newspaper while federal agents are searching his office." Eleanor smiled for the first time since the conversation began. She had spent her career exposing corporate corruption, but she had never encountered someone with Denise Washington's combination of patience, preparation, and strategic thinking. The next few days would be intense, requiring coordination with law enforcement, verification of evidence, and careful attention to legal requirements. But the end result would be something unprecedented, the complete exposure of a criminal enterprise by someone who had spent decades helping to build it. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Eleanor realized that Marcus Whitfield had made a mistake that would define the rest of his life. He had fired the one person who could have continued protecting him from the consequences of his crimes. Instead, he had created the architect of his own destruction. Friday morning arrived at Whitfield Industries with the artificial energy of a workplace trying to pretend nothing had changed. Marcus Whitfield strode through the executive corridor with the swagger of a man who believed he had just solved a problem that had been holding back his company for years. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that announced his presence to anyone within hearing distance. The boardroom had been transformed overnight into what Marcus privately called his war room. A massive presentation screen dominated one wall, displaying a PowerPoint titled "Revolutionary Efficiency Protocols" in bold red letters. Charts and graphs filled the remaining slides, each one designed to demonstrate how eliminating unnecessary administrative layers would drive unprecedented growth and profitability. James Rothstein from legal arrived first, clutching a coffee cup like a lifeline and wearing the expression of someone who had spent the night reviewing termination procedures. Sandra Chen followed minutes later, her laptop bag bulging with files that suggested she had been working through calculations that kept her awake past midnight. David Mueller brought up the rear, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that resembled nervous anticipation. Marcus positioned himself at the head of the conference table, basking in the morning sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view from the 37th floor encompassed the entire downtown district, a panorama of corporate towers and financial institutions that represented the kind of power Marcus believed he was destined to wield. "Gentlemen, Sandra, welcome to the first day of our company's next chapter. Yesterday's difficult decisions have cleared the path for innovations that will revolutionize how we operate. No more bureaucratic bottlenecks, no more outdated procedures, no more resistance to necessary changes." The enthusiasm in his voice was genuine, born from years of frustration with what he saw as institutional inertia. Marcus had inherited Whitfield Industries from his father,
but he had also inherited a corporate culture that valued stability over growth, procedure over profit, and caution over the kind of aggressive expansion that built modern business empires. Sandra opened her laptop and began pulling up spreadsheets that reflected the immediate cost savings from Denise's termination. The elimination of her position saves us approximately $200,000 annually in salary and benefits. Additionally, we can now consolidate her responsibilities across existing staff, creating operational efficiencies that compound those savings. The numbers looked impressive on paper, and Marcus nodded approvingly as Sandra walked through the financial projections. But the calculations were based on assumptions that none of them had bothered to verify. They assumed that Denise's responsibilities were largely ceremonial, that her institutional knowledge could be easily replaced, and that her relationships with regulators and vendors were transferable to other employees. David pulled out his own tablet and began reviewing the operational changes that would take effect immediately. We're implementing streamlined approval processes for all vendor relationships. No more redundant oversight, no more bureaucratic delays. Decisions will be made quickly and efficiently by people who understand that speed is a competitive advantage. The new procedures eliminated multiple layers of review that Denise had established over the years. Environmental impact assessments would no longer require cross-departmental verification. Financial transfers to offshore accounts would be processed with simplified documentation. Regulatory compliance reports would be prepared by junior staff without senior oversight. Marcus was particularly pleased with the changes to their environmental compliance procedures. For years, Denise had insisted on what she called comprehensive impact analysis, a process that involved extensive documentation, third-party verification, and coordination with multiple regulatory agencies. The new procedures would reduce environmental reviews from weeks to days, allowing the company to move forward with project expansions without lengthy delays. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the conversation turned to regulatory matters. His legal training had taught him to identify liabilities, and something about the aggressive timeline for implementation triggered his professional paranoia. Marcus, I understand the desire for efficiency, but some of these procedures exist for important reasons. Environmental compliance isn't just bureaucratic overhead, it's legal protection. Marcus waved dismissively, his confidence unshaken by legal concerns that he viewed as excessive caution. James, you're thinking like the old guard. Yes, we need to comply with regulations, but we don't need to exceed them. We don't need to document every decision in triplicate or seek approval from people who don't understand our business objectives. The conversation revealed the fundamental disconnect between Marcus's perception of regulatory compliance and the reality of how those regulations were actually implemented. He saw environmental laws as obstacles to be navigated rather than requirements to be genuinely fulfilled. He viewed safety protocols as suggestions rather than legal mandates, and he interpreted documentation requirements as optional paperwork rather than evidence that could determine the outcome of future investigations. Sandra pulled another spreadsheet, this one showing projected revenue increases from accelerated project timelines. By eliminating unnecessary review cycles, we can reduce our average project implementation period by 40%. That translates to millions in additional revenue from projects that reach the market ahead of schedule. The projections assumed the eliminated review cycles were truly unnecessary, rather than critical safeguards that prevented costly mistakes. They assumed that faster implementation would automatically result in better outcomes, rather than increased risk of errors that could result in regulatory violations, safety incidents, or environmental damage.
But Marcus was convinced that his analysis was correct, that years of conservative management had created artificial barriers to success.
He believed that Denise's meticulous approach to documentation and compliance represented the kind of risk-averse thinking that prevented companies from achieving their full potential. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Marcus outlining his vision for a leaner, more aggressive version of Whitfield Industries. Department heads would have expanded authority to approve projects without oversight. Environmental assessments would be streamlined to focus on legal minimums rather than comprehensive analysis. Financial reporting would emphasize speed over accuracy, allowing the company to respond quickly to market opportunities. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, the effects of Denise's absence were already beginning to manifest in subtle but significant ways. The Environmental Compliance Department had received a routine inquiry from the EPA about water quality testing at their Tennessee facility, the kind of request that Denise would have handled with a simple phone call to her contact at the regional office. Instead, the inquiry sat in an email inbox that no one was monitoring because the new organizational structure hadn't yet determined who would be responsible for maintaining relationships with regulatory agencies. The junior staff member who eventually discovered the email didn't have the background knowledge to understand its significance or the contact information necessary to provide an appropriate response. In the accounting department, Sandra's team was discovering that several routine financial transfers had been flagged by the bank's fraud detection algorithms. The transfers involved offshore accounts that Denise had established through carefully negotiated agreements with international banking partners. Without her knowledge of the specific procedures required to authorize those transfers, the accounting staff was unable to complete transactions that had been routine for years. The legal department was facing similar challenges with regulatory filings that had been due earlier in the week. Denise had maintained a complex calendar of compliance deadlines, coordinating submissions to multiple agencies with precise timing that ensured all requirements were met without conflicts or overlapping obligations. Without her institutional knowledge, several important deadlines were missed entirely, triggering automatic review procedures that could result in regulatory audits. But these problems remained invisible to Marcus and his leadership team, who were focused on the exciting possibilities of their new operational freedom rather than the mundane realities of regulatory compliance. They were planning expansion projects and revenue growth strategies, while the foundation of legal and environmental protections that Denise had built over 2 decades was quietly beginning to crumble. The afternoon brought Marcus's first public opportunity to demonstrate his new leadership philosophy. A routine press conference had been scheduled to announce the company's quarterly earnings, but Marcus decided to use the platform to introduce his efficiency initiatives to the broader business community. The conference room was packed with financial journalists, industry analysts, and representatives from investment firms who managed portfolios that included Whitfield Industries stock. Marcus took the podium with the confidence of someone announcing a revolutionary breakthrough rather than routine financial results. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitfield Industries is embarking on the most significant operational transformation in our company's history. We're eliminating bureaucratic inefficiencies that have constrained our growth potential and implementing streamlined processes that will drive unprecedented profitability. The presentation included impressive graphics showing projected cost savings and revenue increases, but the analysts in the audience were more interested in the underlying assumptions behind those projections. Several of them had covered Whitfield Industries for years and understood that the company's steady performance had been built on conservative management practices that prioritized long-term stability over short-term gains. Marcus fielded questions with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he had discovered a better way to run a corporation. When asked about potential risks from accelerated decision-making processes, he dismissed concerns as the kind of outdated thinking that prevented companies from achieving their full potential. We're eliminating oversight, we're eliminating redundancy. We're not reducing safety measures, we're reducing paperwork. The fundamental protections remain in place, but we're implementing them more efficiently. The journalists dutifully recorded his responses, but several of them made notes to follow up on the specific changes being implemented.
In their experience, dramatic operational transformations often created opportunities for investigative reporting, particularly when companies claim to maintain safety and compliance standards while simultaneously eliminating the personnel responsible for ensuring those standards. As the press conference concluded, Marcus felt satisfied that he had successfully communicated his vision for Whitfield Industries' future. The stock price had risen modestly in response to the cost-cutting announcements, and early feedback from analysts suggested that investors were pleased with his decisive leadership. But Marcus remained unaware that his former secretary was spending her afternoon in a different kind of meeting, one that would have catastrophic implications for everything he had just announced to the press. While he was celebrating his liberation from bureaucratic constraints, Denise was providing federal investigators with detailed evidence of how those same constraints had been systematically violated for years. Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Corporate Crime Division was reviewing audio recordings that captured Marcus explicitly instructing his staff to falsify environmental testing data. Director James Patterson from the EPA was examining photographic evidence of illegal waste disposal at multiple Whitfield facilities. Commissioner Sarah Davidson from the SEC was analyzing financial documents that showed massive unreported liabilities related to environmental cleanup costs. The timing of Marcus's public celebration of deregulation couldn't have been more perfectly calculated to demonstrate his criminal intent. While he was promising investors increased profits through reduced oversight, federal investigators were documenting years of evidence showing how that same reduced oversight had facilitated systematic violations of environmental and financial regulations. As Friday afternoon faded into evening, Marcus returned to his office with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully launched a new chapter in his company's history. He spent an hour reviewing the positive media coverage from his press conference and another hour planning the implementation timeline for his efficiency initiatives. But 37 floors below, in the parking garage where employees ended their workdays, conversations were already beginning that would eventually reach the ears of investigators, journalists, and ultimately prosecutors. Workers who had been present during environmental incidents were quietly discussing what they had witnessed. Employees who had been asked to falsify documents were beginning to wonder whether their silence was protecting criminals rather than preserving jobs. The transformation that Marcus believed he had initiated that morning was indeed revolutionary, but not in the way he intended. By firing the one person who had spent years protecting him from the consequences of his criminal behavior, he had created the catalyst for his own destruction. The efficiency he was celebrating would prove remarkably effective at exposing rather than concealing the crimes that had built his empire. Monday morning brought the first real tremor to Marcus Whitfield's carefully constructed empire of efficiency. At 8:47 a.m., while Marcus was reviewing weekend stock reports that showed continued investor confidence in his transformation plans, his phone rang with the particular urgency that corporate executives learned to dread. Timothy Chen, the facility manager at their Tennessee chemical processing plant, was calling with news that would have sent Denise Washington into immediate crisis management mode. But Denise wasn't there to receive the call, and Timothy had no idea who else possessed the institutional knowledge necessary to handle what he was about to report. "Mr. Whitfield, we've got a situation here that needs immediate attention. The EPA inspectors showed up unannounced this morning for a surprise compliance audit. They're asking for documentation that I can't locate, and they seem to be particularly interested in our groundwater monitoring reports from the past 2 years.
Marcus felt a flutter of concern, but his confidence in his new streamlined procedures remained intact. What kind of documentation? We maintain all required records in digital format. Everything should be easily accessible. Timothy's voice carried the strain of someone who had spent the morning searching through filing systems that suddenly seemed inadequate for their intended purpose. That's the problem, sir. They want the original, signed inspection reports, the ones with the technical specifications that were hand-verified by our compliance officer. The digital versions don't include the validation signatures that prove our testing procedures met federal standards. The original signed reports were part of an elaborate documentation system that Denise had established to ensure Whitfield Industries could demonstrate compliance with environmental regulations during any type of inspection. Each report required multiple signatures from different departments, creating a paper trail that satisfied regulatory requirements while also providing legal protection for the company. But Marcus had eliminated those procedures as part of his efficiency initiative, viewing the multiple signatures as bureaucratic redundancy that slowed down operations without adding meaningful value. The new procedures required only digital approvals, which were faster and easier to manage, but lacked the legal weight of original documentation. Timothy, just explain to the inspectors that we've modernized our record-keeping procedures, show them the digital files, and explain that they contain the same information in a more efficient format. Timothy's response revealed the first crack in Marcus's confidence. I tried that, sir. They said digital records don't meet federal standards for compliance verification unless they're backed up by original documentation with verified signatures. They're threatening to issue a violation notice if we can't produce the required paperwork by the end of business today. The EPA inspectors were following procedures that Denise had understood intimately after years of coordinating with regulatory agencies. Digital records were acceptable for routine reporting, but compliance audits required original documentation with verified signatures. The absence of that documentation suggested either incompetence or deliberate concealment, both of which triggered enhanced scrutiny. Marcus ended the call with assurances that the documentation would be located and provided to the inspectors. But he was beginning to understand that his streamlined procedures might have eliminated protections that were more important than he had realized. He immediately called Sandra Chen, hoping that the accounting department maintained backup records that could satisfy the EPA's requirements. Sandra's response was not encouraging. Marcus, we transitioned to digital-only records as part of the efficiency initiative. The original paperwork was disposed of according to the new retention policies. We assumed the digital versions would be sufficient for any regulatory requirements. The disposal of original documentation had been specifically recommended by David Mueller as a cost-saving measure that would reduce storage expenses while eliminating unnecessary paperwork. But neither David nor Sandra had consulted with regulatory experts to confirm that digital records would satisfy compliance requirements under all circumstances. Marcus spent the next hour making increasingly frantic phone calls to department heads who were discovering similar gaps in their documentation systems. The legal department couldn't locate original contracts with environmental testing laboratories. The facilities management team couldn't produce signed safety inspection reports. The human resources department couldn't provide original training records that proved employees had been properly certified for hazardous materials handling. Each phone call revealed another weakness in the new procedures, another instance where Marcus's efficiency initiatives had eliminated protections that seemed redundant but were actually critical. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. His streamlined operations had systematically destroyed the evidence base that proved Whitfield Industries was in compliance with federal regulations. By noon, Marcus was forced to make a phone call that contradicted everything he had announced during Friday's press conference. He contacted the EPA regional office directly, hoping to negotiate an extension that would allow his team time to reconstruct the missing documentation. Regional Director Patricia Hernandez was polite but firm in her response. Mr. Whitfield, the documentation requirements for compliance audits are clearly specified in federal regulations. Companies are expected to maintain original records for the periods covered by our inspections. The absence of those records suggests serious deficiencies in your compliance procedures. Marcus attempted to explain that the missing documentation was the result of modernization efforts rather than compliance failures, but his explanation only deepened Director Hernandez's concerns. In her experience, companies that claimed to have lost critical documents during system upgrades were usually attempting to conceal violations rather than improve efficiency. Director Hernandez, I assure you that Whitfield Industries takes compliance seriously. We've simply transitioned to more efficient record-keeping procedures. The information your inspectors are seeking is available in digital format. Mr. Whitfield, digital records are acceptable for routine reporting. but compliance audits require original documentation with verified signatures. The regulations specify these requirements precisely because digital records can be easily altered or fabricated. If you can't produce the original documents, we'll have to assume that the required testing and verification procedures were never properly completed. The implications of Director Hernandez's statement were devastating. Without original documentation, the EPA would treat Whitfield Industries as if they had never conducted proper environmental testing, never followed safety protocols, and never implemented the compliance procedures required by federal law. The penalties for such violations could include millions in fines, criminal prosecutions, and potentially the shutdown of operations at affected facilities. Marcus ended the call with a promise to provide the required documentation by the end of the business day. But he was beginning to realize that such documentation might not exist in any format. His efficiency initiatives had not just streamlined operations, they had eliminated the evidence that proved those operations were legal. The afternoon brought additional crises that revealed the scope of problems created by Denise's absence. The Securities and Exchange Commission contacted the legal department about discrepancies in quarterly financial reports, specifically questioning why environmental remediation costs had decreased dramatically despite increased production at facilities with known contamination issues. James Rothenstein found himself unable to answer questions that Denise would have handled with routine explanations backed by comprehensive documentation. The reduced remediation costs were the result of accounting procedures that deferred expenses to future quarters, creating the appearance of improved financial performance while actually increasing long-term liabilities. But James didn't have access to the detailed records that would explain these accounting decisions, nor did he have the relationships with SEC investigators that would allow him to provide informal clarifications that might prevent formal enforcement actions. Without Denise's institutional knowledge, routine regulatory inquiries were escalating into formal investigations. Sandra Chin was facing similar challenges with banking relationships that had depended on Denise's personal credibility and detailed knowledge of regulatory requirements. Several offshore transfers had been flagged by international compliance systems, triggering reviews that could result in frozen accounts or criminal referrals. The banking partners who had worked with Whitfield Industries for years were suddenly treating routine transactions as suspicious activities, demanding documentation and explanations that Sandra couldn't provide. The personal relationships that Denise had built with compliance officers at major financial institutions had evaporated along with her employment, leaving Sandra to deal with automated systems that were designed to detect exactly the kind of irregular activities that Whitfield Industries routinely conducted. David Mueller was discovering that vendor relationships throughout the supply chain had similarly depended on Denise's personal credibility and institutional knowledge. Environmental consulting firms that had provided favorable impact assessments were now demanding additional verification procedures before agreeing to continue their services. Chemical disposal companies that had accepted Whitfield's waste materials with minimal documentation were implementing enhanced scrutiny procedures that could reveal years of improper disposal practices. Equipment manufacturers that had provided environmental monitoring devices were questioning whether their products had been used correctly, potentially voiding warranties and service agreements that protected Whitfield from liability for equipment failures.
By late afternoon, Marcus was forced to acknowledge that his efficiency initiative had created a cascade of problems that threatened to overwhelm his management team. But rather than reconsidering his fundamental assumptions about Denise's value to the organization, he doubled down on his conviction that these were temporary challenges that could be solved through decisive leadership. He called an emergency meeting of senior staff, determined to demonstrate that Whitfield Industries could overcome regulatory obstacles through the same kind of aggressive problem-solving that had built the company's success. The conference room was filled with department heads who looked like survivors of a natural disaster, each carrying reports of systems failures and relationship breakdowns that seemed to multiply faster than solutions could be implemented. Marcus opened the meeting with characteristic confidence, but his tone carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been present during Friday's celebration. We're facing some transitional challenges as we implement our new operational procedures. These are growing pains, not fundamental problems. Every major transformation involves short-term disruptions that clear the path for long-term improvements. Sandra presented a financial analysis that attempted to quantify the costs of the regulatory complications, but the numbers were alarming even when presented in the most optimistic possible terms. The potential fines from EPA violations could exceed $50 million. The SEC investigation could result in trading suspensions that would devastate the stock price. The banking complications could freeze offshore accounts containing hundreds of millions in assets. James outlined the legal vulnerabilities that were emerging from the documentation gaps, explaining that the absence of required records created presumptions of guilt that would be difficult to overcome in regulatory proceedings. The burden of proof would shift to Whitfield Industries to demonstrate compliance, but they lacked the evidence necessary to meet that burden. David described the operational disruptions that were spreading throughout their supply chain as vendors and partners implemented enhanced scrutiny procedures. Projects that had been moving forward smoothly were now stalled pending regulatory clarifications. Expansion plans that depended on environmental approvals were being delayed indefinitely. The cumulative effect of these reports was the realization that Marcus's efficiency initiative hadn't just eliminated redundant procedures. It had destroyed the foundation of legal and operational protections that allowed Whitfield Industries to function as a legitimate business. Without those protections, they were exposed as what they had always been beneath the surface, a criminal enterprise that had avoided prosecution only through the meticulous efforts of someone Marcus had casually discarded. As the meeting concluded, Marcus made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his continued failure to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Rather than acknowledging that he needed to reverse his efficiency initiatives or seek expert guidance on regulatory compliance, he decided to double down on his aggressive approach by eliminating even more oversight procedures. If regulatory agencies wanted to treat routine business operations as criminal activities, then Whitfield Industries would simply minimize their exposure to regulatory oversight by conducting more of their operations through offshore subsidiaries and shell corporations. If banks wanted to scrutinize legitimate financial transactions, then they would find alternative channels for moving money that avoided traditional banking systems entirely. Marcus believed he was solving problems through the same kind of bold decision-making that had built successful businesses throughout history, but he was actually accelerating his own destruction, creating additional evidence of criminal intent that would be impossible to explain away when federal prosecutors eventually presented their case to a jury. The day ended with Marcus feeling confident that he had successfully navigated the first major challenge to his transformation initiative. But 3 floors below, employees who had witnessed the day's chaos were having conversations that would eventually reach the ears of investigators who were already building criminal cases against their employer. The efficiency that Marcus was celebrating would prove remarkably effective at documenting rather than concealing the crimes that had built his empire. Tuesday morning brought news that shattered Marcus Whitfield's remaining illusions about controlling the crisis engulfing his company. At 6:15 a.m., while Marcus was still reviewing damage control strategies over his morning coffee, Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Corporate Crime Division was coordinating the largest multi-agency raid in the Bureau's recent history. 12 black SUVs pulled into the parking lots of Whitfield Industries facilities across 4 states simultaneously. Federal agents wearing FBI windbreakers emerged from vehicles alongside EPA criminal investigators, SEC enforcement officers, and representatives from the Department of Justice's Environmental Crimes Section. The coordination was precise, overwhelming, and designed to prevent the destruction of evidence that prosecutors would need to build their criminal cases. At Whitfield headquarters, Agent Torres presented building security with federal search warrants that covered every floor, every office, and every electronic device connected to the company's network. The warrants were extraordinarily comprehensive, reflecting months of preparation by prosecutors who understood they would have only one opportunity to gather evidence before defense attorneys could intervene. Marcus received the first phone call about the raids while he was stuck in traffic on his way to the office. His head of security, Frank Rodriguez, was barely able to maintain his professional composure as he delivered news that no corporate executive ever wants to hear. "Mr. Whitfield, federal agents are executing search warrants throughout the building. They've taken control of all computer systems, seized financial records, and they're requesting interviews with senior management. You need to contact legal counsel immediately and avoid coming to the office until this situation is resolved." The magnitude of the federal response suggested that prosecutors possessed evidence of serious criminal activity, not merely regulatory violations that could be resolved through negotiations and fines. Marcus understood enough about corporate investigations to recognize that simultaneous multi-site raids indicated a criminal conspiracy case involving multiple defendants and extensive evidence gathering. His first instinct was to call James Rothenstein for legal guidance, but James was dealing with his own crisis as federal agents seized his computers and demanded access to privileged attorney-client communications. The scope of the search warrants suggested that prosecutors had convinced a federal judge that Whitfield's legal department was part of the criminal conspiracy, rather than innocent advisors caught up in regulatory violations. Sandra Chen was escorted from the building after agents discovered encrypted files on her computer containing financial records that appeared to document systematic money laundering operations. Her careful accounting procedures, which had helped Whitfield avoid detection for years, now provided prosecutors with detailed evidence of how environmental cleanup costs had been hidden through offshore transfers and shell corporation transactions. David Mueller was arrested at his home while attempting to delete files from his personal laptop that contained communications with environmental consultants about falsifying safety inspections. The digital forensics team had already recovered the deleted materials, creating additional obstruction of justice charges that could result in lengthy prison sentences. The federal agents were following investigative protocols developed through years of corporate crime prosecutions, but they were also working from intelligence provided by someone with intimate knowledge of Whitfield's operations. Denise Washington had spent the previous weekend walking investigators through the company's organizational structure, explaining which offices contained the most damaging evidence and which employees were likely to have knowledge of specific criminal activities. Agent Torres found herself in Marcus's executive office, examining filing cabinets that contained precisely the documents Denise had described during her debriefing sessions. Original contracts with environmental testing laboratories that specified fraudulent reporting procedures. Correspondence with offshore banking partners that detailed money laundering protocols. Meeting transcripts that captured explicit discussions of bribery and regulatory manipulation.
The evidence was overwhelming in both quantity and quality, representing decades of criminal activity documented with the thoroughness that only an insider could provide. But Agent Torres was particularly interested in a safe hidden behind Marcus's bookshelf, secured with a combination that Denise had observed him entering during countless private meetings over the years. Inside the safe, investigators discovered what prosecutors would later describe as the crown jewel of their evidence collection: original audio recordings of conversations between Marcus and representatives from organized crime families who specialized in waste disposal and regulatory intimidation. The recordings captured explicit discussions of bribing EPA officials, threatening environmental activists, and eliminating witnesses who might cooperate with federal investigators. Meanwhile, at the Tennessee facility where Monday's EPA inspection had triggered the initial crisis, criminal investigators were documenting environmental damage that extended far beyond regulatory violations into the realm of deliberate ecological destruction. Groundwater contamination covered an area encompassing 3 counties, affecting drinking water supplies for over 50,000 residents who had never been informed that their wells were compromised.
The scope of environmental damage was staggering, even by the standards of investigators who specialized in ecological crimes. Soil samples revealed contamination levels that exceeded safe limits by factors of hundreds rather than percentages. Air quality monitoring detected toxic emissions that had been disguised through falsified testing procedures and bribed regulatory officials. EPA criminal investigator Maria Santos was documenting evidence that would support not just environmental violations, but conspiracy charges related to crimes against public health. The contamination patterns suggested deliberate dumping operations that prioritized cost savings over human safety, resulting in preventable illnesses and deaths that could support homicide prosecutions under federal environmental statutes. Back in the city, Marcus was discovering that his legal problems extended beyond federal criminal charges to include civil liability that could destroy his personal wealth and corporate empire. Environmental advocacy groups were filing class action lawsuits on behalf of communities affected by Whitfield's contamination operations. Medical researchers were documenting cancer clusters and birth defects linked to chemical exposures that had been concealed from public health authorities. The financial implications were becoming clear as analysts examined the true costs of environmental cleanup and victim compensation. Conservative estimates suggested liabilities exceeding $2 billion, amounts that would bankrupt Whitfield Industries and potentially trigger criminal prosecutions for securities fraud related to the concealment of those liabilities from investors. Marcus spent Tuesday afternoon in the office of criminal defense attorney Harrison Blake, a specialist in white-collar prosecutions who had built his reputation defending corporate executives against federal conspiracy charges. Blake's initial assessment was devastating. The evidence suggested a criminal enterprise that operated for decades with the explicit knowledge and participation of senior management. Harrison, these are regulatory violations that got blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors. We maintained all required documentation and followed industry-standard practices for environmental compliance. Blake had reviewed enough corporate crime cases to recognize the denial patterns that preceded lengthy prison sentences. Marcus, the federal agencies have executed search warrants at 12 facilities across 4 states. They've arrested 3 of your senior executives and seized financial records documenting systematic money laundering operations. This isn't a regulatory dispute. It's a criminal conspiracy prosecution. The conversation revealed the gap between Marcus's perception of his actions and the legal reality of criminal liability for corporate executives. He viewed environmental violations as business decisions that carried manageable financial risks. Prosecutors viewed the same actions as deliberate crimes against public health that warranted lengthy prison sentences and massive financial penalties. Blake explained that successful defense against federal conspiracy charges required demonstrating that clients lacked knowledge of criminal activities or were misled by subordinates who concealed illegal operations. But the evidence suggested that Marcus had not only known about environmental violations, but had explicitly ordered them as cost-saving measures that improved quarterly financial performance. The audio recordings from his office safe would be particularly damaging because they captured Marcus personally negotiating with criminal organizations about waste disposal operations that violated multiple federal statutes. Defense strategies that relied on claiming ignorance or delegation would be impossible to maintain when prosecutors could play recordings of Marcus explicitly discussing illegal activities. As Tuesday evening approached, Marcus was beginning to understand that his efficiency initiative had not just eliminated bureaucratic procedures, but had destroyed the protective systems that concealed decades of criminal activity. Without Denise's institutional knowledge and regulatory relationships, the evidence of environmental crimes was being exposed faster than legal counsel could develop containment strategies. The federal investigation was expanding beyond Whitfield Industries to include regulatory officials who had accepted bribes, environmental consultants who had falsified testing data, and organized crime figures who had provided illegal waste disposal services. The scope suggested a conspiracy case that could result in dozens of prosecutions and reshape how environmental crimes were investigated and prosecuted. Wednesday morning brought news that completed Marcus's transformation from confident CEO to desperate criminal defendant. The Securities and Exchange Commission had frozen all Whitfield Industries trading pending disclosure of the true scope of environmental liabilities. The Environmental Protection Agency had issued emergency shutdown orders for all facilities pending comprehensive safety inspections. The Department of Justice had announced a criminal investigation targeting corporate executives for conspiracy, money laundering, and crimes against public health. But perhaps most devastating of all, the morning newspaper featured a front-page story by Dr. Eleanor Martinez that began with a simple but devastating sentence. For over 20 years, Denise Washington documented every crime, every cover-up, and every conspiracy that built Marcus Whitfield's criminal empire. Now she's ready to tell federal prosecutors everything she knows. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 a.m. Thursday morning in a conference room that felt more like a funeral parlor than a corporate headquarters. The mahogany table that had witnessed decades of profitable decisions now hosted a gathering of individuals who understood they were presiding over the collapse of everything they had built. Board Chairman Robert Sterling, a 72-year-old veteran of multiple corporate crises, opened the meeting with the grim efficiency of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. The federal investigation has exposed criminal activities that extend back over 20 years. Our legal counsel advises that the company faces potential bankruptcy, criminal prosecutions for senior management, and civil liabilities that exceed our total assets. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, isolated from the other board members who had spent the previous 48 hours consulting their own attorneys about personal liability exposure. His usual confidence had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had finally grasped the magnitude of his miscalculations. Board member Catherine Walsh, representing the pension funds that held significant Whitfield stock positions, spoke with barely controlled fury. "Marcus, we need to understand how a routine efficiency initiative resulted in simultaneous federal raids and criminal prosecutions. Our fiduciary responsibility requires immediate answers." Marcus attempted to maintain his characteristic decisiveness, but his voice carried the strain of someone whose worldview had been systematically demolished. The federal response is disproportionate to any alleged violations. We're dealing with regulatory overreach that's being driven by disgruntled former employees seeking revenge rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Sterling interrupted with the authority of someone who had navigated corporate scandals for over 4 decades. "Marcus, the Department of Justice doesn't coordinate multi-state raids based on employee grievances. They execute operations of this magnitude when they possess evidence of serious federal crimes. What exactly did Denise Washington have access to during her tenure?"
The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Marcus had never bothered to learn the full scope of Denise's responsibilities because he had viewed her role as administrative rather than strategic. But the federal investigation was revealing that her administrative duties had included maintaining evidence of every criminal conspiracy that sustained Whitfield's profitability. Board member Thomas Chen, Sandra's uncle who had recommended her for the chief financial officer position, spoke with the measured tone of someone calculating personal liability exposure. "The media reports suggest that our financial reporting contains systematic misrepresentations about environmental cleanup costs. If those allegations are accurate, we're facing securities fraud prosecutions that could result in lengthy prison sentences for board members who approved fraudulent financial statements." The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Board members who had rubber-stamped financial reports without questioning obvious discrepancies now faced personal criminal liability for securities fraud. Directors who had approved environmental projects without demanding comprehensive impact assessments could be prosecuted for conspiracy charges related to public health crimes. Sterling called for a formal vote on Marcus's termination, but Marcus was already gathering his materials with the dignity of someone who understood
that his corporate career had ended along with his freedom. "I'll be submitting my resignation effective immediately. But I want this board to understand that Denise Washington spent 23 years documenting private conversations and confidential business operations for the purpose of building a criminal case against her employer. Her actions constitute the worst kind of corporate espionage and betrayal of fiduciary duty." The accusation revealed Marcus's continued failure to understand the moral dimensions of the crisis he had created. He viewed Denise's documentation of criminal activities as a betrayal of loyalty, rather than evidence of crimes that demanded accountability. His perspective reflected the entitled mindset of someone who believed that wealth and position provided immunity from legal consequences. Walsh stood up and walked toward the conference room windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. "Marcus, Denise Washington didn't create the crimes she documented. She didn't force you to bribe regulatory officials or dump toxic chemicals in drinking water supplies. She simply recorded evidence of criminal activities that you chose to commit over a period of decades." The conversation was interrupted by Sterling's assistant, who entered the conference room with the pale expression of someone delivering catastrophic news. "The Department of Justice has just announced criminal indictments against Marcus Whitfield, Sandra Chen, David Mueller, and 6 other current or former employees. The charges include conspiracy, money laundering, environmental crimes, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO prosecutions were reserved for the most serious criminal enterprises, typically involving organized crime families or drug trafficking operations. The application of racketeering statutes to corporate environmental crimes suggested that prosecutors viewed Whitfield Industries not as a legitimate business that had made compliance mistakes, but as a criminal organization that used corporate structures to facilitate systematic lawbreaking." Marcus left the building for the final time through a service entrance that allowed him to avoid the media encampment that had assembled in the main lobby. Reporters who specialized in corporate crime were broadcasting live updates about indictments that could reshape how environmental prosecutions were conducted in federal courts. But the most significant development was happening simultaneously in a federal courthouse downtown, where Denise Washington was being sworn in as the star witness in what prosecutors described as the largest environmental crime case in Justice Department history. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Rodriguez addressed the federal judge who would oversee the criminal prosecutions with the confidence of someone who possessed overwhelming evidence of guilt. "Your Honor, the government's case is built on documentation provided by someone who spent over 20 years observing and recording criminal activities from a position of extraordinary access. Mrs. Washington's testimony and supporting evidence will demonstrate that Whitfield Industries operated as a criminal enterprise that systematically violated federal environmental and financial laws." Denise sat in the witness section wearing a navy blue suit that projected competence and credibility. Her demeanor remained calm and professional, the same composure she had maintained through thousands of corporate meetings where criminal conspiracies were planned and executed. Defense attorney Harrison Blake attempted to challenge the credibility of evidence obtained through what he characterized as corporate espionage. But Judge Patricia Morrison rejected his arguments with the authority of someone who understood the legal principles governing whistleblower protections. "Mr. Blake, your client is charged with operating a criminal enterprise that endangered public health and defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. The documentation supporting those charges was gathered by someone who had a legal and moral obligation to report criminal activities to appropriate authorities. The court will not entertain arguments that characterize law-abiding behavior as corporate espionage." The hearing concluded with prosecutors outlining a timeline for trials that would likely extend over the next 2 years, involving dozens of witnesses and thousands of exhibits documenting criminal activities that spanned multiple decades. The scope of the prosecution suggested that Whitfield Industries would be remembered not as a successful business empire, but as one of the largest criminal conspiracies in corporate history. As Denise left the courthouse, she walked past reporters who shouted questions about her motivations and future plans. She didn't respond to their inquiries, maintaining the professional discretion that had characterized her entire career. But her silence spoke volumes about the transformation she had undergone, from invisible secretary to the architect of accountability for crimes that had been hidden in plain sight for over 20 years. 18 months after Marcus Whitfield fired the woman he believed was expendable, he stood in an orange jumpsuit before federal judge Patricia Morrison for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental activists, and family members of victims whose lives had been destroyed by decades of systematic poisoning disguised as legitimate business operations. Judge Morrison had presided over corporate crime cases for 15 years, but the Whitfield Industries prosecution represented the most comprehensive environmental crime case in federal court history. The evidence presented during 6 months of trials had documented criminal activities so extensive and devastating that prosecutors had requested sentences typically reserved for organized crime leaders and international terrorists.
Marcus Whitfield, you have been convicted of operating a criminal enterprise that poisoned drinking water supplies for over 50,000 American citizens. Your organization systematically bribed federal officials, falsified environmental testing data, and conspired with organized crime figures to dispose of toxic waste in violation of federal law. The evidence shows that you personally authorized operations that resulted in preventable cancers, birth defects, and deaths that constitute some of the most serious crimes against public health in our nation's history. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Morrison reviewed the victim impact statements that had been submitted by families whose children had developed rare cancers linked to Whitfield's contamination operations. Medical experts had documented disease clusters in 3 states that were directly attributable to chemical exposures that Marcus had concealed from public health authorities for over 2 decades. Sandra Chen had already been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to money laundering and conspiracy charges. David Mueller received 15 years for his role in coordinating the falsification of safety inspection reports. James Rothstein was serving 8 years for his participation in bribery schemes involving EPA officials. But Marcus faced the most serious charges because prosecutors had proven that he was the architect of the criminal enterprise rather than a subordinate who followed orders from others. The audio recordings from his office had provided devastating evidence of his personal involvement in planning operations that prosecutors characterized as crimes against humanity. Denise Washington sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing the same navy blue suit she had worn during her testimony months earlier. Her presence served as a quiet reminder that accountability had been achieved through the courage of someone who had chosen to speak truth to power despite personal risks that could have destroyed her life. Her testimony had been the foundation of the government's case, providing prosecutors with detailed knowledge of Whitfield's operations that no external investigation could have uncovered. She had explained complex financial schemes, identified key participants in criminal conspiracies, and provided documentation that proved criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorney Harrison Blake made a final attempt to minimize his client's culpability by arguing that Marcus had relied on advice from subordinates who had concealed the true nature of their operations. The argument was undermined by evidence showing that Marcus had personally negotiated with criminal organizations and explicitly approved operations that he knew violated federal environmental laws. Mr. Blake, your client was recorded discussing the murder of environmental activists who threatened to expose contamination operations. He personally authorized the disposal of toxic waste in drinking water supplies to save money on legitimate disposal costs. These are not the actions of someone who was misled by subordinates. They are the deliberate crimes of someone who valued profit over human life. Judge Morrison's sentencing decision reflected the unprecedented nature of the environmental crimes and their devastating impact on public health. Marcus Whitfield was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life paying for crimes that had destroyed thousands of innocent lives. The financial penalties were equally devastating. Whitfield Industries was ordered to pay $4.2 billion in restitution to affected communities, an amount that exceeded the company's total assets and guaranteed its immediate bankruptcy. Marcus personally forfeited all assets acquired through criminal activities, including his mansion, offshore accounts, and investment portfolios that prosecutors proved had been funded through environmental crimes. But the most significant outcome of the prosecutions was the transformation they created in how environmental crimes were investigated and prosecuted. The Whitfield case established legal precedents that allowed prosecutors to use organized crime statutes against corporate executives who systematically violated environmental laws. Environmental advocacy groups hailed the sentences as validation of their arguments that corporate environmental crimes should be treated as seriously as other forms of organized criminal activity. The case demonstrated that wealthy executives could no longer expect to avoid meaningful consequences for decisions that endangered public health and environmental safety. Denise Washington's role in exposing the criminal conspiracy had transformed her from an invisible administrative assistant into a national symbol of corporate accountability. She had received job offers from environmental organizations, consulting firms, and government agencies that recognized the value of her unique combination of institutional knowledge and unwavering integrity. But Denise had chosen a different path forward, one that reflected her lifelong commitment to protecting communities from corporate environmental crimes. She established the Washington Institute for Environmental Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other potential whistleblowers document and expose corporate environmental crimes. The Institute provided legal protection, financial support, and expert guidance to employees who possessed evidence of environmental violations but lacked the resources or knowledge necessary to navigate complex regulatory and legal processes. Denise understood that most corporate environmental crimes were concealed by employees who remained silent out of fear rather than complicity. Her first major case involved a chemical manufacturing company in Louisiana whose employees had documented systematic violations of air quality regulations that were causing respiratory illnesses in surrounding communities. Using investigative techniques developed during her years at Whitfield Industries, Denise helped workers compile evidence that resulted in federal prosecutions and hundreds of millions of dollars in restitution for affected families. The success of the Washington Institute attracted attention from environmental organizations throughout the country, leading to partnerships with groups that had been fighting corporate pollution for decades without access to the kind of insider documentation that could support successful prosecutions. Denise hired a staff of former regulatory investigators, environmental attorneys, and forensic accountants who specialized in uncovering corporate environmental crimes. The offices of the Institute were located in the same downtown district where Whitfield Industries had once operated, serving as a constant reminder that corporate criminals could no longer hide behind wealth, political influence, or regulatory capture. 3 years after Marcus Whitfield's sentencing, Denise received a letter from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric oncologist who had treated children affected by Whitfield's contamination operations. The letter described improvements in cancer rates among children living in previously contaminated areas, reductions that were directly attributable to cleanup operations funded through criminal restitution payments. The medical improvements represented the ultimate validation of Denise's decision to expose crimes that had been hidden for decades. Her documentation had not only resulted in criminal accountability for corporate executives, but it also saved lives by forcing cleanup operations that removed toxic chemicals from drinking water supplies. Martinez's letter also included photographs of children who were healthy because contamination sources had been eliminated before they could cause additional illnesses. The faces in those photographs represented the human cost of corporate environmental crimes and the human benefit of holding criminals accountable for their actions. Denise kept the letter in her office desk, alongside copies of other correspondence from families whose lives had been improved by environmental cleanup operations funded through criminal prosecutions. The letters served as daily reminders that her decision to speak truth to power had consequences that extended far beyond corporate boardrooms and federal courtrooms. The transformation of Denise Washington from invisible secretary to environmental justice advocate demonstrated that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption when supported by careful documentation and strategic disclosure. Her example inspired other corporate employees to come forward with evidence of environmental crimes, creating a network of accountability that made it increasingly difficult for companies to conceal systematic violations. The Whitfield Industries case had established that corporate environmental crimes would be prosecuted with the same seriousness as other forms of organized criminal activity. Executives who endangered public health could no longer expect to avoid meaningful consequences through political influence or regulatory capture.
But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the demonstration that accountability was possible when people with access to evidence had the courage to prioritize public health over personal loyalty to criminal employers. Denise Washington had shown that even the most powerful corporate criminals were vulnerable when their crimes were exposed by someone who understood how their systems actually operated. Marcus Whitfield had believed that firing an administrative assistant would streamline his operations and eliminate bureaucratic obstacles to increased profitability. Instead, he had created the catalyst for the largest environmental crime prosecution in federal court history. As Denise reviewed her institute's annual report documenting environmental prosecutions that had resulted from corporate whistleblowing, she reflected on the irony of Marcus's mistake. He had fired her because he wanted to eliminate someone who documented corporate activities too thoroughly. In response, she had dedicated her life to helping others document corporate environmental crimes with even greater thoroughness and effectiveness. The office where she now worked looked out over the same downtown district where she had spent 23 years witnessing crimes that endangered public health and environmental safety. But instead of being forced to maintain silence about criminal activities, she now helped others find their voices to speak truth to power. The phone on her desk rang with calls from corporate employees who possessed evidence of environmental violations and needed guidance on how to protect themselves while exposing crimes that threatened their communities. Each call represented another opportunity to transform institutional knowledge into accountability for corporate environmental criminals. Denise Washington had learned that the most effective form of revenge against corporate criminals was not personal retaliation, but professional dedication to ensuring that similar crimes could never again be concealed from the communities they endangered. Her legacy would be measured not in the destruction of her former employer, but in the protection of countless future victims who would be spared because corporate environmental criminals could no longer hide behind wealth, influence, and institutional silence.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.